Wolfgang Beltracchi did not forge copies of existing paintings. That single fact, so easy to overlook and so completely devastating once understood, is what separates him from every art forger who came before him. Every other counterfeiter in history has worked from an original. They study the brushwork, steal the palette, rehearse the signature, and reproduce something that already exists. Beltracchi did something categorically stranger and far more philosophically interesting. He studied the catalogue raisonné, the complete official scholarly record of a dead artist's entire life's work. And instead of copying what was there, he looked for what wasn't, the gaps, the missing years. The rumored canvases that scholars had theorized might exist but had never materialized, the lost periods. And then he painted them, brand new, never-before-seen works that he imagined the artist might have created, if only history had been slightly different, and claimed they had simply been hidden away for decades, waiting quietly to be discovered. He was not stealing anyone's art. He was inventing a new chapter of a dead man's life, and the entire art world swallowed it whole and asked for more. Before a single painting ever reached an auction house, Beltracchi ran it through a gauntlet of his own devising. He would quietly submit his freshest forgeries to reputable, expensive art authenticators, not to confess and not merely to test his nerve, but to collect structured feedback. If any expert flagged something as off, a pigment inconsistency, a provenance detail that didn't quite hold, a brushstroke that didn't belong to the period, Beltracchi would correct the painting before it ever went to market. He was, in effect, using the world's most distinguished art scholars as his personal quality control team, peer-reviewing his own fraud with the field's most credentialed referees. Not a single one of them ever knew they were part of the operation. There are also allegations, advanced by the Beltracchis themselves, that at least one art assessor received fees large enough to effectively purchase his silence. If true, the fraud was not merely a matter of fooling experts, it was a matter of buying them. The distinction matters enormously. Fooling the world's best minds is a remarkable achievement. Corrupting them suggests something darker about the institutions meant to protect the integrity of art. Werner Spies was not a careless man. He was the former director of the Centre Pompidou in Paris, one of the most prestigious modern art institutions on the planet, and the world's leading Max Ernst scholar. He had spent decades studying Ernst with an intimacy most academics reserve for their own work. He knew the texture of Ernst's ambitions, the arc of his obsessions, the way his hand moved across a canvas in a given decade of his life. He was, by every measure, the single most qualified human being alive to say whether a Max Ernst painting was real. He personally authenticated multiple Beltracchi forgeries and issued official certificates of authenticity for them. French court later ruled that Spies and a gallery owner must pay a collector over 652,000 euros in damages for authenticating a fake Ernst that had sold for nearly $1 million. His expertise, the accumulated labor of a formidable intellectual life, had become the very instrument of the fraud. The credentials that made his word unimpeachable were the credentials Beltracchi needed to make the forgeries unimpeachable. It was not a failure of knowledge. It was a failure of the very system that knowledge creates, a market so dependent on authority that authority itself becomes the target. And then there was Dorothea Tanning, Max Ernst's widow, the woman who had lived beside him for decades, who watched him paint, shared his meals and arguments, knew the particular way light fell across his studio when he was working, understood his silences as well as his words. She looked at one of Beltracchi's forgeries, a painting her husband had never touched, never imagined, that had not existed in any form until Beltracchi decided it should. And she declared it the most beautiful painting Ernst had ever made. Not merely convincing, not merely good, the most beautiful. The forgery had not only passed her test, it had surpassed everything the real man ever achieved, at least in the eyes of the person who loved him most and knew him best. The implications are vertiginous. Either Beltracchi understood Ernst's potential better than Ernst himself did, or the very idea of authenticity, of a painting's value being tied to its origin, begins to collapse under the weight of that moment. The paintings alone were not enough. A convincing forgery needs provenance, a documented history of ownership that explains how a work traveled from the artist's studio through the decades and into the present. Beltracchi understood this, and so he built one from scratch. He and his wife Helene staged black and white photographs using pre-World War II photographic paper, guaranteeing that the images would age authentically and pass any material analysis. In the photographs, Helene dressed in period clothing and posed as her own grandmother, standing among the very forgeries they were about to sell as inherited family heirloom. Christie's auction house was so thoroughly convinced that it used one of Beltracchi's fake paintings on the cover of a major evening sale catalog. The forgery was not buried in a footnote. It was the crown jewel of the event, the face they put forward to the world as the highlight of their sale. One catastrophic detail sat in plain sight for years, and not a single expert found it worth their attention. The story required Helene's grandfather to have been, in the 1930s, the close personal friend of a Jewish art dealer in Nazi Germany, a man the regime was actively persecuting. The problem was that the grandfather had been a teenage member of the Nazi Party at precisely the moment this friendship was supposed to be flourishing, and later served in the German army during the war. The idea that this man was the trusted confidant of someone Hitler was targeting was not merely improbable, it was historically impossible. And yet not a single auction house researcher, Providence Committee, competing collector, or rival scholar, check. They were too busy examining pigment. The history, apparently, could be taken on faith. As early as 1995, 15 years before his eventual arrest, Beltracchi had come extraordinarily close to being caught. A scientific investigation found that 3 of his forgeries contained a synthetic pigment not commercially available until 1957, yet the paintings were supposedly created in the early 1920s. Police suspected him. He was formally investigated. The evidence was not strong enough to charge him, and he walked free. Then he kept painting, kept selling, kept refining his methods. For another decade and a half, the system had reached out, touched the truth, recoiled, and let him go. When police eventually raided the Beltracchis, they seized over $1 million from a Swiss bank account. The couple declared bankruptcy, separately, as if the universe wished to make a point about how systemic the problem was. A cascade of fakes attributed to Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, Robert Motherwell, and Willem de Koonings began unraveling through Knoedler Gallery in New York, one of the oldest art dealers in America, founded in 1846. Knoedler shut its doors in 2011 after 165 years in business. When a journalist directly asked Beltracchi whether the Pollock fakes were his, he smiled and replied, "That was definitely not me." Then, after a pause that contained an entire philosophy of artistic confidence, "But I could have done them." After prison, Beltracchi did not disappear. He returned to painting, as this time openly, under his own name, and his original signed works now sell for over $80,000 each. He gave interviews. He laughed easily. On CBS, he said, with the ease of a man who has already won every argument that matters, "My art is everywhere, in many museums." Then, with a slight tilt of sarcasm and private collections, he walks free. He paints, he sells. He is, by any honest accounting, one of the most gifted painters of the 20th century. It is simply the success was credited to other names. And somewhere tonight, in a museum that does not yet know the truth, a painting he made hangs on a white wall under a soft spotlight, and people stand before it in genuine silence, moved to something they cannot name, believing they are in the presence of a dead master's irreplaceable genius. They're not wrong about the feeling. They're only wrong about the hand. The masterpiece is real. The artist on the label never made it.